Well, hello. It's time for today's history moment here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Today we're going to talk about the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. As you can see behind me, this is the garden that sits outside Old St. Mary's Cathedral. It was the second Catholic church in Philadelphia. Philadelphia in the 1800s was very cosmopolitan. Yeah, Lutheran, Episcopal, Catholic, Jewish, all types of religious institutions dating back in that period. And this is the Philadelphia that you tend to see during the American Revolution and the very beginning of the Declaration of Independence. As we walk around, you'll start to see some of the sights, and I'll just begin to talk. Anyway, to begin, the Declaration of Independence was started to be written on the 11th of July, 1776. By then, the fighting had already started in New England. President John Hancock had assigned John Adams, Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence, and they would do it until until June the 28th, 1776. So essentially, from the 11th to the 28th, you start to see the construction of the Declaration of Independence. Now, what we often see with the Declaration of Independence is quite different from what was originally designed and originally written. There were 3 or 4 clauses in the Declaration of Independence that were actually taken out. They were part of the original. One clause, which was written by Thomas Jefferson, had to do with what King George III did with Native Americans. He accused King George III of having Native Americans attack the colonists. The issue is that some Native Americans were supporting the colonists, like the Oneida up in New York. So when he wrote that part of the Declaration of Independence, many people in the Continental Congress said, you have to take that out. This is problematic. Another part that was taken out, probably more historically famous, was Thomas Jefferson's push to remove slavery. He accused George III of keeping the institution of slavery going, for sanctioning the purchase of humans and selling them, and for forcing the colonists to endure the institution. The Continental Congress also took that out. Now there actually tends to be some history behind Thomas Jefferson's addition to the Declaration of Independence when it came to that institution. And there have been many misconceptions over the decades and even centuries as to what to think of it. What a lot of people forget is that slavery was being practiced at that time by many countries: Britain, France, Spain, Holland, and of course, a country that is often not talked about is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which was an Islamic empire, practiced slavery. They practiced it before the British did, or any European country did, and they practiced it more. Most of the African slaves that were taken out of sub-Saharan Africa ended up going to the Middle East. However, nowadays we often don't hear that side of the story. We tend to focus on those who were brought to South America, the Caribbean, and North America. We don't talk about the fact that well over a disproportionate amount were taken into Asia and the Arab areas of the Middle East by the Ottoman Empire. Now, of course, those who want to talk about slavery to justify whatever beliefs they may have will be all too quick to smooth that horrible, horrible fact over, which is why you often don't hear about it. As far as Thomas Jefferson was concerned, He was in a different spot. He was married. His wife had a half sister, and technically she was enslaved. This, of course, is the famous Sally Heming. Thomas Jefferson seems to be in love with Sally Heming. He took care of her and their children. He kept her in his house. And in the 1760s, he actually tried to abolish slavery. But slavery was a very tough topic at the time, particularly in Virginia. If you wanted to emancipate or free your slaves, the British Crown would prosecute you, possibly take your property, leave your family destitute, and the very people that you freed would be sold off to someone else. So ultimately, you didn't free anyone. And this was one of the big issues that Thomas Jefferson had when it came to slavery. So he puts that in the Declaration of Independence, and he blames King George III for it because, in many ways, the king was behind it. It's very interesting, too, because now in 2026, there are people who think that George III was very sympathetic because of Queen Charlotte. However, they don't talk about the fact that George III kept the institution alive. And he was not the only king. Here in Philadelphia, they have been protesting slavery since the 1690s. So by 1776, Philadelphia had seen 86 years of protests against slavery. As a result, Thomas Jefferson puts this in the Declaration of Independence. However, many of the people who are part of the Continental Congress actually own slaves themselves, including possibly very famous generals and statesmen. Actually, it's quite factual. So they didn't want that in the Declaration of Independence. However, they believed that colonies would be able to get rid of slavery as they saw fit, which is why states like Pennsylvania started to get rid of slavery in 1780, even during the American Revolution. So a lot of times when we think about things like slavery, when we think about, say, the Civil War, for example, what is important to remember is that many parts of the United States got rid of slavery as far back as the American Revolution, not the Civil War, and Pennsylvania was one of these places. The Declaration of Independence goes before the Continental Congress. However, a lot of things occurred between its writing and the Continental Congress validating. The British pulled out of Boston in March of 1776, with General Washington mounting cannon and driving them out. They start to write the Declaration of Independence on the 11th of June. On the 28th of June, it's complete. And what happens the very next day? The 29th of June, His Majesty's Royal Navy arrives in New York Harbor with the intention to occupy New York, just like they had occupied Boston a few months earlier before they were driven out. This, of course, reaches Philadelphia. But around the time that it reaches Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence ends up before the government, because Philadelphia was the Continental capital. So they begin to vote on July the 2nd. They pass the resolution for the Declaration of Independence to be passed, and they make the alterations to strip out certain parts. So that by July the 4th, which is the day that we celebrate, the Declaration of Independence is seen as going into effect. John Adams personally thought that we would be celebrating on July the 2nd, because that's when it was actually voted on. However, the final draft was the 4th, so that's the day that we've celebrated it for 250 years, coming up this July the 4th. And thank you for your time, and feel free to subscribe. Hopefully we'll share more experiences of history moments in Philadelphia. Thank you.